So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name's Sally Stanton and I am the Director of Education at Advantage Schools. And we're really grateful that you found the time to join us this evening as we're going to talk about assessment and what we mean when we talk about assessment at Advantage Schools. Hopefully you can see my screen and see my PowerPoint. Stuart, can I just check with you whether you think we're able to see the PowerPoint rather than just my me?
I think we can see the PowerPoint, yes.
Okay, brilliant.
I've managed to mess up my ratios, so not sure, but yes.
Yeah, I've done something very odd to my screen, so do feel free to use the chat if you are like, what PowerPoint are you referring to, and we'll try and sort that out, but hopefully you can see it. So, as I said, I'm Sally Stanton, Director of Education at Advantage Schools. Stuart, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would. I'm Stuart Locke. I'm Chief Executive at Advantage Schools, small trust based in Bedford. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see so many people.
Excellent. This is the second of two taster sessions that we've been running for our what we're calling our Advantage Schools Knowledge Exchange, which actually will officially launch in September. And basically we're really looking forward to sharing what we do on assessment, and we're going to go into some detail about something that we refer to as DDI. So we will explain what we mean by DDI, what that stands for and everything. But the reason that we've chosen to focus on this is because very often it's a key thing that visitors to our schools most often want to hear more about, like how does that work? And people sometimes contact us and ask for a meeting with us to talk about it. So we thought it'd be useful to share and get that information out there. We're also really conscious that it's quite tricky to sum up how it works in an hour or so. And we are really conscious that we want these sessions not to just be like a little informative type session. We want it to enable you to perhaps implement something in your own schools that you think would be useful. But it does take some careful thought to do that. So for that reason, our follow-up email will also be quite detailed with some of the tools perhaps to strengthen your understanding, help you reflect on how it could work for you. You'll also get a recording of the session. We will send through some links to some videos actually exemplifying some of the DDI conversations and professional learning that we have in our schools. And that will give you a chance to see some more focused conversations that's actually come out of these DDI conversations as well, and a guidance document that should help you think about, if you did want to set up and run a similar process, how you might think about doing that in your school. And we'll also send not one but two PowerPoint presentations with a script that focus on assessment that might be useful for you to use in your schools as well. Please do use the Q&A function to ask us questions. So you should be able to see that at the bottom of the screen. We're really hopeful we'll have time to get to them, although we are a little bit conscious that we've probably got too much content to get through. If we don't get to the questions and answers, what we will do is we will type a response and send it out in the email that follows. So if we get started then and move on to our next slide. So in terms of behind the buzzwords, this is a list of the buzzwords that you would have seen when you registered. And these are the terms that we really hope to demystify this evening. So we're going to be looking at formative and summative assessment, what we're talking about when we talk about things like the domain and the sample, validity, reliability. Something that we mentioned in the last webinar was the idea of the curriculum as the progression model, and what does that actually mean? And then DDI stands for data-driven instruction. Don't get hung up at this point on the word data, because that is something that we're going to talk about as well. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about data? And all of this is kind of intended to inform really responsive classroom teaching.
It's worth saying, Sally, isn't it, that the reason it's called DDI is because we were inspired by Paul Bambrick-Santoyo's Driven by Data and the first chapter of Leveraged Leadership, where it was called that. We've moved significantly away from Paul's script over DDI, but we've not changed the name because it's been part of our kind of artifacts of our schools.
Absolutely, yeah. And some of that is laid out on the document, the follow-up document you'll get as well, which will give you the further reading if you're interested in going to the original source of all of those ideas. Just as a bit of a warning before we get started, whilst we believe that good assessment is an essential part of ensuring the curriculum is learned, it's very important that we don't consider assessment to be the curriculum or drive the curriculum. Now, that sounds really obvious, but I think that we all know that it doesn't and hasn't always worked that way. And an example would be when the exam specifications changed a few years ago, exam boards produced kind of year 7 versions of GCSE exams. And in my mind, that's an example of where actually the assessment has been allowed to dictate what it is we teach. So because we knew what would be assessed, the curriculum meant we need to teach that. And actually what our assessment should do is serve the curriculum. The assessment should be there for us to be able to measure how well learned the curriculum had been, but not to dictate what the curriculum actually is to us. And in terms of understanding assessment, these are 2 books that have really influenced our thinking. And I think good assessment practice is important, but I do think it's a really hard part of our jobs, and understanding the limitations of what assessment can tell us, that can be really hard to get your head around, especially when for so long as educators we've looked at numbers and we've thought about data and what's the data saying, and just a personal kind of reflection from my point of view was that it's very recently that I had even heard about the terms reliability and validity in terms of assessment. Now, maybe I'm unusual in that, maybe you're sitting there thinking, what's she talking about? Like, that was covered on my PGCE and has been all through my career, people have talked about it. But for me, there was lots of talk about assessment for learning, and AFL techniques, but nobody or nothing I'd ever read had led me to encounter kind of what are the limitations of assessment, what can we do to make an assessment more or less valid, and it was really actually Stuart that introduced me to a lot of these ideas. And I don't know, Stuart, whether maybe this was something that you found easy.
Exactly the same. I think the first time I came across those terms was at the second Research Ed conference in London, where Daisy Christodoulou was talking to a packed room about assessment. I didn't know there was as much to know as there was, and I've never heard the terms of validity and reliability. And they have very much become buzzwords, of course, because you hear people now using them, but they use them interchangeably, and you never hear them separated, or rarely hear them separated, to discuss what they actually mean and whether assessments can be reliable or not valid. I think we're going to go into that in a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think kind of one of the things that we've kind of talked about is how it's very difficult actually to measure pupil learning, and it's very difficult to know what pupils have learned, but there are some things that we can do that might make exams better, that might make assessment better.
Yeah, I mean, the whole exam question, particularly around year 11 and year 13, but also actually year 6 this year, and the discussions about potentially replacing exams. I mean, I've been very publicly against the cancellation of formal examinations, but the discussion, I think, has really highlighted a worrying gap in our collective understanding in the profession about assessment. Like, the first thing is that, of course, exams don't give an exact measure of everything that pupils know, how much they know from the curriculum, and we have to accept that. That's true, and really important. But you can make exams better, and you can make them better in a manner that we're going to talk about, or exams can be better or worse, I think is a better way of saying it. But crucially, like, teacher assessment also doesn't give an exact measure of the whole curriculum and of what pupils are able to, where pupils are according to the curriculum. And it's actually worse for inferring what pupils know when you go across a whole scale. Teacher assessment's really good in the classroom. It's really good for learning about what pupils know and can do and what they need to know and can do. And there are hundreds and thousands of data points that teachers will have at every single, or in pieces of information is a better way of putting it, in every single lesson, that allows us to teach better, to reinforce, to make sure that pupils have really embedded things in long-term memory. Hundreds and thousands of those, but like, that's much better for that purpose than exams. But exams, in terms of measuring where pupils are across the whole curriculum, summative assessment, if you like, the inaccurate, but the most accurate way nonetheless of measuring what pupils can know and can do. So externally validated, standardized, moderated assessments give a better measure or comparison about what pupils know and can do. Teacher assessments can't do that. So I don't know if you're going to say this, Sally, but it's worth getting your head around assessment theory and supporting all of our teachers to understand that that's a worthwhile goal. It makes our curriculum better. Curriculum and assessment go hand in hand. And as you said, you're going to share some resources to follow up. But these two books, the two, Daisy's is efficient and brilliant, really well written. Daniel Corrett's, the Harvard academic, has written Measuring Up, which really, like, you get the point as you get to the end of it. It's an easy read. It's a really good read. People sometimes say to me, you know so much about assessment, and most of it comes from just having read that book on the right. So really recommend them.
Yeah, agreed. I think they're both really worthwhile putting a bit of time into. So summative assessment then, thinking about summative assessment, this is where I'm going to have to multitask and animate my slide, which is always, should be simple, but never is as simple as I think it's going to be. So I'm going to take you through kind of some of the features of summative assessment, and this is very much coming from the Christodoulou book that we just showed you actually, but summative assessments should be taken infrequently in standard conditions. We'll talk about this in more detail later. They should sample from a much larger domain, and the idea is that they are used to create a shared understanding of progress. And that should enable us to distinguish between pupils. And really, a summative assessment should be designed to enable pupils to show us what they know or what they can do. And so on the right-hand side now, I'm sort of going to reflect with this is sort of our secondary model actually, how we have taken those ideas to inform our summative assessment. So our kind of key data points, our assessment points, happen twice a year. All students complete the same work in the same conditions, preferably at the same time. It's made very clear to our staff that the assessments are supposed to measure mastery of the domain, which for us is the taught curriculum, and then that would be reported as a percentage. And that means that those percentages can be compared to the class average, to the year average, and so that helps us to kind of see what pupils know and how much of the curriculum potentially has been mastered, and we'll go into more detail about the limitations of that. So first thing is, we've used one of those buzzwords there. We've used the word domain and the idea of sampling from the domain. So we're going to now look in a little bit more detail about that and what that can actually mean. So if you imagine the domain is absolutely everything that you want pupils to have mastered, so you know, in a topic or a subject area, everything you want them to know. So in this visual representation, that would be the dark red. It's everything. And then the sample is a really carefully selected part of that whole domain, and you assess that sample. And the idea is that should enable you to make inferences about what it is of the whole domain the students have mastered. So again, in this representation, those would be the very bright red dots might be the sample that you pick out and you assess pupil understanding of this. Now, it's really important that we don't just treat this as an arbitrary job. So we can't just think we'll just select 10 random questions from a taught topic and we'll paste them into assessment. Because obviously, if we really want to be able to make a decent inference about how much of that big picture pupils have, we have to have thought really carefully about which aspects are important for us to sample, what's the best way to sample it, and will the things that we're sampling actually help us to make decent inferences about the pupil knowledge of the whole domain. So if we were to take a really bad example of this, it would be that the little red dots became the curriculum. So this is where your assessment would drive your curriculum. We know that we're going to be asking about that little red dot on the right hand side. So I'm going to teach my pupils that little bit of knowledge really, really well. And then all of a sudden I'll have pupils that are performing very well on an assessment because they know that content really well because it's maybe all I've done for the last term or longer. But actually it doesn't tell me about all the other stuff. It would be giving me an absolute false sense of confidence in their mastery of the domain because I've only sampled from a very small section that I've also made sure I've over focused on in my teaching. Stuart, have you got anything to add to that before I move on?
No, I think you've really summarised it well. That the sample becomes the curriculum is really common. We see this a lot in really poor examples of Key Stage 2 practice, of course, where from year 4 or year 5 onwards, pupils are being taught the the perception of what is going to be sampled in the reading and the mathematics assessments at the end of Key Stage 2. And of course, we see it very often in secondary schools where GCSE exam questions are used right back to Year 7.
And like where the curriculum becomes, how do you answer a 6-mark question? But and like, this isn't, I don't want this to come across actually as like a criticism of teachers, because it's really understandable. Like assessments, like terminal assessments for pupils are really high stakes. We know it means a lot to them. Professionally, it means a lot to us. But even down to the level where, you know, I've written before Key Stage 3 assessments, so I know what's on the assessment because I wrote it, but the rest of the department don't, because we don't want them to teach to the test. But that, like, it's really, really difficult in your lessons when you know you're covering the stuff that's definitely on that assessment, not to either think I need to, you know, it's in your head that it's there and that therefore you really want them to know this stuff, but also that then you're almost tempted to go the other way and be a little bit too blasé about it because you don't want to give it anything away. So it's very difficult, and I think we need to acknowledge it's kind of part of being human. If you know what's on the assessment, it will influence our behaviours, and so what we need to do is be really aware of that and do our best to act in a way that would mean that it didn't
I completely agree. To labour that point, like if you know what's on the test, it's impossible not to teach to it to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
For it not to influence you. Yeah.
So one of the things we talked about last time was the curriculum as the progression model in terms of when you're assessing. Stuart, do you want to talk a little bit? I'll do the animating of the slides, and you can have the freedom to talk about it.
Yeah, great. Like what all I want to say really is that our assessment system is low stakes, like it's not used for performance management, but it's relatively high trust. In fact, it's very high trust, but it's supposed to be, and implemented well, low workload, and gives us a good sense of quality assurance. So that's why all of this fits together when you get to the end, in something that we think means that we know our school incredibly well, that our pupils are not left behind, or if they are, we know about it and able to do something about it. And so our summative assessments, it's like jumping to the end, but this is really important in terms of making sure our assessments measure the curriculum as well as we can. They measure the sample measures the domain as well as we can. And of course, the domain isn't what was taught in the last topic or the last 6 weeks. The domain is what they should have learned in the subject. And in the example you see on the screen, that means back since the start of Year 7. Actually, I think this is rarer than we might think in many schools. And it wasn't, I led schools where we didn't do this for a long time. And actually we now do, although we only do 2. We only do 2 assessments a year, 2 formal assessments, as you said earlier. So our summative assessments need to measure how successfully our pupils are mastering what they've been taught through that growing domain, the growing amount they've been taught as they work through it. Therefore, it needs to sample from all of the teaching students have had over time. And we've got back to Year 7 here, but actually it could go in some subjects back to Year 6, 5, 4, etc. So we showed this image in our last webinar on curriculum. It demonstrates how our assessments need to draw on the knowledge across terms and years, rather than just focusing on like an end of unit assessment and assuming that pupils are doing really well or really badly, or fluctuating as a result of those assessments on things that have just been taught. And of course, we know that we believe that if things are not embedded in long-term memory, then they haven't been learned. So if you're taking a test in Year 9 and there's things from Year 7 on the assessment, that's perfectly reasonable, because we expect it to be learned over time, not just recalled at the end of a half term. As was mentioned by Sally, what we choose to sample requires really careful thought. And to help us decide, we need to think about what we want to assess, think regularly about what we want to assess. The questions in the box on the right can help us make some of those decisions and make good selections from the domain when we're designing our assessment. So, for example, in some subjects, there may be aspects of the Year 7 curriculum that are so fundamental to future learning that the Year 7 proportion of the assessment even takes up the lion's share of the Year 9 assessment. Alternatively, year 7 content may have just been a grounding for something that's been deepened in year 8 and year 9. So the actual content from year 7 does not need sampling, as it is like enveloped within the year 9 sample. So it depends on the subject, it depends on the topic, it depends on your curriculum. And these decisions, of course, can be messy and down to debate, and subject leaders and teachers without question need time and support to think about this carefully so that our assessments are useful.
Sorry, I just realised I was still muted. So to kind of give a bit of an example of one of the things that you might do to work through this is to almost take like a blank graphic like this, and to sit there with your curriculum map and to think, if you reflected on your subject and everything that the pupils have done as is mapped out on your curriculum, what do you want to draw through in those curriculums? So if I were to think about my subject, English, and by the way, I'm not suggesting that this is what people should assess in English, but I'm just using it as an example to think through. I might start off by thinking, okay, what are those core skills that pupils are going to need time and time again? So I might say, okay, well, I think grammar is really important. So I'm going to have a significant part just checking grammar in year 9, and that's going to go into the year 9 test. And then I might sort of think, okay, what's needed short term for later? So an example, at our secondary, we teach Jekyll and Hyde in year 7. Now, I don't think, like, you could disagree with this, but I don't think I necessarily need them to remember in their future key quotations or intricacies from the plot. But I want them to retain an understanding of genre. I want them to be familiar with Victorian novels and context, and hopefully it will have expanded their vocabulary. So I probably won't think it's really important in year 9 to include a specific section on Jekyll and Hyde, but I might include some questions about genre, some questions about structure, some questions of vocabulary that might have been informed by that learning in year 7. And then if I'm thinking about what's really important later in life, well, actually back in year 7, we start the year with a unit on Greek mythology. And actually, I think I might say, well, I think they're really important too. I do want them to really remember some of the detail of that, because it's so commonly alluded to in literature. So I think that will enrich their understanding of literature. I think it will make it easier for them to have a way into understanding literature throughout their studies in English literature. So I might make sure that I've got a part in there just to check they've remembered those details. So going through that process, you can see how you might start to sketch out what your assessment model actually looks like. And you might end up with something a bit like this, where you've made your decisions, you've made your bets on the things that you think are worth assessing in year 9. And one thing I'd say is, like, you know, someone will go, well, you've got Shakespeare in there. Why is Shakespeare only out of 10 when you've got writing out of 32? And those are all really valid questions to ask. But the point is that whoever designs the assessment should have thought about that really carefully, based on their knowledge of the curriculum and based on their thought about what came before, but also what's coming later. And Stuart, I think this is quite different in maths, but you know, as you're a maths specialist, would you envisage a Key Stage 3 year 9 maths assessment being very different from that sort of process?
Yeah, it might be. I mean, like, it depends on the shape of the curriculum, right? We often talk about maths being more hierarchical and English being potentially, arguably, more cumulative as a subject. And actually, Ruth Ashby's great book on curriculum has really challenged me that they're quite primitive terms in terms of unpicking it. But nonetheless, you might, in formative assessment, have unpicked that pupils are able to solve an equation, know square numbers, know the geometry of right-angled triangles, and a number of other things, and those are fine. In summative assessment, you might just have a question on Pythagoras, which builds all those things in, because you're not trying to find out why they got it wrong or why they got it right. You want to know if they've taken all those components and managed to do the composite, which is the top of that bit of the hierarchy in terms of being able to solve a question or a difficult question on Pythagoras. You're not necessarily going and unpicking the components because it's summative assessment. It's, and so we might have taught Pythagoras in year 9, or the other things in year 8 and year 7, or even before that in terms of times tables and so on. Those things are all being tested in one Pythagoras question.
And that's a really nice example of how, like, the final goal, the performance, might look very different from the practice, like the composites and the components. And brings us on really nicely, I think, actually to formative assessment. One of the things I said about like summative assessment is it's a chance for pupils to show us what they can do. And I think that when we're thinking about formative assessment, it's a bit different, isn't it? Do you want to talk through some of the features?
Yeah, so on the left are the things that Daisy Christodoulou lists in her book again, about the features of formative assessment. And on the right are our expectations certainly in our secondary school, but actually I'd say expectations in our primary school as well. And I think it's really important to understand that formative assessment takes almost an infinite number of forms. Like we might have a 10-question quiz, or we might be assessing pupils a number of times they contribute to a discussion, or other quite nebulous things that might reside in a teacher's head that we're going to have examples of later. Like back in the bad old days, we might put levels or GCSE grades on some of those things. Like that's not particularly helpful for identifying what it is the pupil needs to know or be able to do to get better at the subject in question. But the teacher's assessment that's going on constantly through the lesson, particularly with expert teachers, means that there's incredible amounts of information that we expect our teachers to have, to record, as we're going to talk about later, record really, really briefly in the manner that's suitable to them, in order that they know what pupils can do and what they need to be able to do, what we're doing about it, i.e. what they can't do and what we're doing about it. And that's different from subject to subject. We wouldn't ever expect a maths mark book to be different to be the same as a PE mark book, but we do expect there to be some form of a mark book. And the reason for that is we're human. We can only hold a certain number of things in our heads. If we've got 30 pupils times 5 classes, or in the case of RE times, I don't know, 20 classes or something, like how do you hold all the information about what pupils know and can do in your head? You can't. You need to export it to what we call a messy mark book. And it's called messy because we're never in our school going to dictate what your mark book should look like. We expect you to know what pupils know and can do and record it, know what they can't do and record it, and think about how you're planning your lessons. We expect you to be able to talk to that with the support of your mark book, but we don't expect to give you a form of a mark book or how you record these things, because it's really different in, as I said, PE or drama or music, between those subjects, but also maths, English, history. Like that's down to the subject leader.
Yeah, so we've actually got some examples of what we call the messy mark books to share with people. And when Stuart and I were preparing for this, we were almost like, we're looking at them and we're like, what even is that? Like, what does that mean? But that's the whole point. It's not there. Like, this is very different from summative assessment. Is about being able to share an understanding. But the messy mark, but the formative assessment is in the ownership of the teacher. I mean, getting a teacher to kind of to give you a grade that they think a piece of work a pupil has done in a random lesson isn't really actually helping that teacher think about at that granular level what exactly is it that a pupil can or can't do. So now, like, I'm really happy when I go and visit our primary school and I see like the children are working and the teacher is walking around, they're doing a bit of like over the shoulder looking, a little bit of feedback, a little bit of prompting, supporting, but they're also writing down just on this kind of like seating plan, and it's just a mess. It's just scribbles and lines. But it should be, well, it doesn't have to be a mess to me, but it doesn't matter if it looks like a mess to me, because the point is it means something to that teacher, and it's for them, it's their building an idea about what pupils can learn. So we wanted to show you a range of examples as well from different subjects, just to kind of get the idea across. There is no set way of doing it. It does really need to be the ownership of the teacher. So this, for example, is a PE version, so they have chosen to do theirs online. It's a simple yes, no, you know, did a pupil get an answer right or wrong? A 0 is wrong, a 1 is they got it right. So it's really then easy for them to look across. So obviously the names have been cut out, but if you were working from left to right, you would have the names down the left hand side. So as you scan across, you can see that you've got some pupils who are performing at like 80%, who, you know, as a pupil you probably don't have concerns about them, but then you've got some pupils who are like at 40-30%. So you know, okay, those are maybe my pupils that I need to do something different, check in with, whatever it is. And then down at the bottom, you can see by topic level. So you can see there that there's question 4 now. It says power test, but I don't know exactly what it was, but obviously that was something that a lot of pupils struggled with. So that's maybe a topic area that you need to go over, that you need to think about in a bit more detail. How did you teach that? Like, this means absolutely nothing to me, but this is somebody in maths who was like, had developed a very I think that it was actually to them super helpful, because I think it almost like automatically pulled out from a lookup table what the question was about, so enabled them to do all sorts of granular understanding of tracking, like what pupils knew and didn't know. But I would need the teacher to explain to me what it was telling them. I can't look at that and share that understanding.
All of these, Sally, are that, though, aren't they? All of them are like, none of them are for us to go and say, like, what does this say? It's to say, the question is, what have the kids, what have you taught the kids, what have they learned, and what have they not learned, and what are we doing about it? That's the questions that we ask, which we're going to talk about later.
Absolutely, yeah. So likewise, history, another sort of IT version, a really different one. So one of the science teachers likes to keep it much more on a Word document, and they just kind of list who struggled with different topics. Whereas another science teacher just prefers to have a code system that they use in the back of a mark book. And this is actually my mark book for English, and like, I imagine it doesn't mean anything to anyone else, but to me, I know what the numbers, I know what the letters, I don't know now, but at the time I would have known what section of the lesson that related to, so I could then go back and think about reteaching different sections of the lessons if pupils had struggled with them, or knew what intervention I might need to put in place if there was just maybe one pupil that needed some support. So that's like, just to give you the overview of the messy mark books, completely what the teacher wants to do, but the idea is they make notes so that they don't forget, and they're able to think about what it is that pupils do or don't know. And basically, I think, Stuart, we're ready to talk about data-driven instruction now, or did you want to say anything else?
I just want to, just for the sake of completeness, say that the phrase "messy mark book" came from Christine Council. Like, we didn't make it up, like a few years ago.
Yeah, and don't try to Google it, because when Stuart first started talking about messy mark books, I thought it was some deeply known about embedded AFL practice that I'd never heard of before, and I was like, I don't know what a messy mark book is, and so I tried Googling it, and it got me nowhere, which is why I wanted to give examples so it could kind of bring it to life. But this is really key, because I mentioned earlier data-driven instruction, which we refer to as DDI for short, and that's because the information that those teachers have about pupil learning is the absolutely most important driver in our assessment system. So we have data-driven instruction, which is basically conversations, scheduled cycles of conversations around pupil learning that focus on the information that teachers know about their pupils. So some of you will have seen that I shared a blog on Friday on our Twitter. I'm just giving you a moment to read this extract from it. And that's just to kind of frame this idea that for us, when we're talking about data, what we mean is information. And when anyone talks about data, we should mean information, not numbers, not flight paths, not grades, information we've gathered about pupil learning, and how should that inform our teaching. And that is absolutely what data should be about and what should it focus on, which I think is what led you to say this, Stuart.
Thanks.
I'm not going to make you read out loud because it's a bit weird to quote yourself, but yes. And so this idea that, like, we've talked before about, should we still call it data-driven instruction because of those somewhat negative associations with data, but actually I think it's kind of embedded that everyone talks about DDI in our schools now. So the challenge is actually that we need to reclaim that term data and make it mean information rather than just numbers again. But it does present a bit of a challenge for senior leaders, does it not, Stuart?
Of course, because like, what you want to know, like, but when I was a worse senior leader than I am now, I took solace in the data. The data confirmed to me that my school was okay. I could put it in front of an inspector if I needed to. I could put it in front of governors and so on. And it took me quite a long time, prompted by the books that we mentioned earlier and discussions with people, to realise that actually lots of what we were producing was nonsense. In a previous headship, I I challenged this with governors by putting the 84-page data report they got every 6 weeks in front of them and said, I can go through that and pretend I know how the school is from it if you like, or we can actually talk about what I know about the school, because it's not the same as what comes out of those numbers. And they said, okay, first of all, tell us why the numbers aren't reliable. And that was a useful point for us. School leaders, I think, should want to know their schools incredibly well, and specifically to what extent are pupils learning the curriculum? Is the curriculum good enough? Will pupils achieve good outcomes? And how and where can we do better? Like, that's what we want to know. And we're really mindful of avoiding a couple of pitfalls in creating this. The first is creating incredible work. I realise this is on the spreadsheet, but it's really easy because we're desperate to know that our school's okay, and the only information we have, and particularly now without externally set exams, the only information we have shows what schools used to be like, certainly externally validated. It's really tempting to create unhelpful workload for teachers, to do like book looks they expect to see like pupils redrafting things for the sake of making things look better, or whatever it might be. It might be, you could argue, that it would be quicker and easier for us to collate lengthy reports or ask heads of department to submit packs of evidence of pupil progress through the curriculum that would be quick and easy for us to digest instead of the data reports. But that would add to teacher workload, and we want our teachers putting their time and energy into providing a great education for the pupils rather than making life easier for senior teachers. And the second part is that we need to avoid the Hawthorne effect, the fact that when you're observing a subject, their behaviour alters, which means you won't get the genuine understanding you're looking at from lesson observations, book looks, or scheduled learning walks. And that goes alongside Goodhart's law or Campbell's law, the idea that when something is high stakes, when a measure is high stakes, it ceases to be a valid measure, a good measure of what's going on. If we make book looks or packs of evidence from, and we're inspecting those from our colleagues, then you can guarantee that that pack of evidence, because they're human, will not be a valid measure of how good the curriculum is or how well pupils are achieving, the things we want to know on the left. So like, that's a real big challenge for us, and it's really easy for it to drive things that are invalid measures of how good our school is. And I understand why we might be tempted to do it all the time, because particularly as head teachers, like our necks are on the line if our school isn't good enough, right? So we need to know constantly our school is good enough. But there's a bit of like all the stuff that we might do, or some of the stuff that we might do that I described earlier, actually might make us feel reassured, but doesn't really tell us anything. We're just pretending. And I don't know if on the next slide. So our use of DDI is designed to keep our leaders and teachers focused on pupil learning of the curriculum by seeking to regularly, and I mean regularly, answer these questions. The answers to these questions are based on what the teacher knows about their classes, and they're often captured in the sort of notes that we've shown you that we described as the messy mark book. They don't have to set formal assessments. They don't have to do tests for this. We encourage teachers to use what they know and have exported from their heads or from their experience to their mark book, make notes and respond to the questions. The response to the questions is done in the moment. So we have a 10-minute meeting between heads of department and classroom teachers about the year group that we're focused on that week. And sometimes it comes up with a problem. Sometimes like, actually, I don't know, or like I found it real difficult because almost all the pupils aren't learning the curriculum. Because these conversations are low stakes, at least if somebody tells you that actually the pupils over the last 5 weeks in year 8 haven't learned very much, you know it's accurate and you could do something about it, and you don't go more than 5 weeks without finding it out, as I'm going to describe in a bit. That's the kind of issue that is the sort of thing that gets unpicked in our cycle of DDI meetings. It means that the problem that the teacher has getting the pupils to learn becomes a problem for heads of department and later for senior leaders.
I think as well, like it's worth saying that some things don't even make it to the conversation because the teacher will have we all know that we notice in the moment as we're teaching, a pupil even looks a bit confused. You might re-explain something, you might check something, like I said earlier, circulating and giving that kind of support. So there is that kind of first level in the classroom where, we wouldn't expect our teachers not to respond to pupil learning issues so that they could talk about DDI. So there's still that standard. So the conversations in data-driven instruction are really focused on that next level of after the lessons taught, kind of what was still a sticking point by the end of the lesson. So
and we're going to model the conversations in a minute, Sally, right? Yeah.
I think there should be, this is like the cycle, yes, and then you'll see an example conversation. So the way the cycle works is obviously you've got that classroom teacher who is doing that formative assessment and responding in response to what they learn about pupils' gaps or misconceptions as they teach. And then the subject leader would meet with all of their teachers to discuss and agree actions, trying to basically pull out what are the common issues arising at class level. So, you know, if you're in a primary across maybe a couple of classrooms, are there some common issues that pupils are struggling with? In a larger school, you would have far more classes to try and pull out those common issues. So
it's
that's
really
kind of the... Pardon?
Sorry, I was going to say something. I thought you finished. Carry on. Sorry.
That's right. But then also thinking about individual pupil needs too. So within that, it might be that most of the class did understand something, but actually this pupil or this small number of pupils are really, really struggling with it. Did you want to come in on that, Stuart, before I move on?
Like I was just going to say, like it might feel to people looking in that this is really cumbersome. It's really important to say that this goes really fast, like meetings are 10 minutes maximum. I think if we say, our policy says, if it goes on 15 minutes, stop, because you've done enough.
And you know, like there might be some individual pupils who, but actually across classes, there might not be things that are proving really sticky, especially once you've been doing it for a while, because you'll see in a moment how the cycle constantly leads to reiteration and improvement of resources and things. So and then so once the subject leader has met with all of their teachers as part of their line management conversation, there'll be a conversation with senior leaders again, kind of just, were there any common issues, or are there any particular pupils in need of support? So it might be that at that department level, something happened at department level, people shared best practice, people came up with ideas, the expertise of the head of department might have, or the phase lead might have led the teachers to think about what they could do in the next lesson to address the issues around pupil learning. It might be that actually it's a fairly significant issue that needs to have like a much more in-depth conversation, and maybe going to the senior leader and saying, perhaps we've got a training lead around this, perhaps we need to get some external eyes on it. So all kinds of conversations might come out of that. As you'll also see, one of the follow-up resources that we'll share with you is a video of a whole load of professional development that came out of DDI conversations. So the DDI enabled the school to focus on a really particular aspect of the curriculum, and then to have some CPD focused on it. But again, obviously, they would also talk about the individual pupils that are in need of support. And that's really important, because those, as a senior leader, you need the view across the school of actually there might be pupils who are struggling across the whole curriculum, and you've got all those teachers working in isolation. Maybe there's something more broad strokes that needs to be put in place to support that pupil. And then the outcome of that is, at whichever level, there will be action taken to move pupils forward in their learning, and then the cycle begins again, because you go back to that teaching, formative assessment, responsive teaching, or the problem solving cycle. And then there are kind of two aspects that spring from this. As I said, senior leaders will then all the senior leaders will meet together to discuss kind of like who are, where is the pupil need, like which pupils are in need of support, might be in need of some support, or actually which subject areas might be really struggling. But also at department level, it's not just talking about what can we do to address this issue with these pupils right now, but thinking next year when we teach this again, is there anything about our resources that we could do to make our first time teaching as good as possible? Is there anything to do with what we've learned through this cycle that will mean next year when we're teaching this again, we do it even better? So that's kind of how the constant cycle works. So in terms of the class overview, this is very much talking about in generally what's been covered. And Stuart, I think you often say that how like the conversations, the important thing. So the questions are just there to prompt a conversation and aren't the conversation.
Yeah, so you can go off script if it's useful to you, is absolutely right. But I also want to just pick up on, like, you think about what leaders need to know. The previous slide that you showed, Sally, showed that leaders every 5 weeks having discussions, or about every 5 weeks, depending on what comes up, having discussions about every single pupil in the school, making sure that they're on track to learn the curriculum, i.e. making progress. Like, that's a pretty heavy amount of quality assurance, although it's high trust, because hypothetically, I suppose, like somebody could be pulling the wool over your eyes. But if you combine that with the very high presence of senior leaders in our schools, it triangulates, and the summative assessments, it triangulates really well. But you're right, the conversation is probably the most important part. And so the don't get hung up on the questions. The key idea is that the subject leader supports staff in identifying effective ways to move forward where learning has been, particularly when learning has been problematic. The conversation should lead to a shared understanding of the actions that be taken to move pupils forward in their learning. And it might be one pupil, it might be none in some cases, and it might be a few. Teachers will generally implement actions and interventions within the classroom, including revisiting and reteaching knowledge explicitly to fill gaps, or responding to misconceptions. So example actions that come out are reteaching content during a reteach week or individual lesson, review questions with pupils, retest things while delivering new content, i.e. We know that the retrieval practice is helpful, but also we know that the assessment we might have set, or we might have, you know, like when teachers go, I'm not quite sure that that assessment is accurate, they might have understood more than I thought. We might set an intervention with a specific subgroup to ensure pupils improve their knowledge, or we might set homework to self-quiz a specific topic area using retrieval practice to improve, or a set of key questions. And we might follow up with whole class retrieval practice. I should say that these meetings, as I said, are really short, but also we do a number of other things, take away not responsibilities, but take away the workload parts of our behaviour system. We in the last couple of years before the pandemic, cancelled all after school meetings, for example, and things like that. So these happen during the school day.
And you said something really important then, but which I should have emphasised more, that it's not every single class every week, it's a cycle of year group focus.
Yeah, so the year 8 this week, year 9 the week after, year 10 so on. But also this is a sort of conversation schools regularly have an expert in having with year 11. But having these conversations, low stakes and very regularly, all the way through pupils' journey through the school, hopefully, and in our experience with our outcomes, shows that actually we get to year 11 and there's less need for that kind of like intensive intervention, who's on course for a grade 4, grade 5, etc., because we've done this from the very start.
You've also mentioned workload, and I think it's worth saying that we don't have like a books must be marked. So we don't expect our teachers to write in pupil books with any set frequency. Like if they want to, they're more than welcome to, but there is no evidencing that you have written in pupils' books for feedback, because we know that we're having these conversations so regularly that we know that the teachers are attentive to what pupils have or haven't learned and responding accordingly. And obviously, like, we may well look at books anyway as part of our other QA process, our presence around the school, being in classrooms, you see pupils learning, or even the DDI process might, if there's something that teachers are struggling with, the head of department might look at the books with the teacher to try and unpick some of the issues that pupils are having. So books get looked at, but they don't have to be written in with like a what went well EBI, that kind of thing. And we've actually got an example to show you. It's a 3-minute clip. It's an extract from, so you'll get the longer video link with the follow-up to this, but this is just really because I thought it was useful as we're talking about this for you to see what it might look like. A very specific secondary science meeting where the head of department is pulling out a specific aspect that the teachers have reported pupils are struggling to articulate an understanding of, and how it leads how the conversation goes and leads them to some outcomes.
For year 11 and CC12, equilibrium shifts, positions and changes.
So they're just getting confused in their answers, talking about the equilibrium changing. So it's not changing. The position of it is changing, and just therefore their wording around that. And I'm aware that that's like a combined higher thing. only really, and a triple thing, but I don't know if the triple lot are getting confused by that at all. But yes, just because it's a brand new thing, and therefore they're being led down a route thinking that if it's shifting to the left, only that reaction is then happening, rather than like more of that reaction happening, kind of visualizing it like a seesaw almost. So yeah.
That's actually, the way you've described it there, the seesaw analogy, that's actually a really good way to sort of help them to visualize it. So that could be one way around it.
There is a tendency with that to think, oh, well, it reacts and that makes some, and then it basically stops at some. So it's very difficult for them to understand that it's happening in both directions all the time.
So the way that I explained that is something that I tried last year. I think it was with Sam's group, where I said, you know that silly game you all used to play at primary school and PE, where you have cones and one team would go around turning the cones, all of them upside down, and there'd be another team of people going around turning them the right way up, and they're all like nodding. I was like, well, that's basically our forward backward reaction. So they're both happening at the same time, and if at any point you stop the game, you've always going to have roughly the same number of cones the right way up and the same number of cones upside down, because the teams are always working at like the same rate. And they seem to understand that though the forward backward reactions are always happening, it's just when the question says, okay, so we've increased the temperature, then what? Some of them are saying, well, they want to decrease temperature, so only the backwards reaction will happen, or the equilibrium changes so that this, and so it's just nitty gritty, getting the wording and understanding like bang on.
And I think I'm seeing model answers for that, and if we're able to sort of work out visualizer answers or whiteboard answers or chat. For year 11,
sorry, don't want to play that again, do we? So as I said, kind of that's just an extract from it, but I just thought it would kind of be useful to see what that conversation is like, and actually how quite quickly you can get into the detail of what's happening. And some of the outcomes that came from that conversation is this idea of coming to some sort of agreement over how we might visually represent the process, working collaboratively then to maybe script an explanation, really modelling the precise language that pupils could use, planning that model answer, thinking about like what questions we might use to in future teaching to check pupil understanding at kind of different stages. And then obviously going back, and what the science department are really good at is they always then go back and they look at the resources that they use to teach that and make improvements there and then, so that next year when they come back to it, they have all of that in place and ready to go. Stuart, did you want to talk a bit here about the sort of the senior leadership side of bringing all of the information together and how it does help senior leaders? So
we've got superstar John Moore, who sets up a really intricate spreadsheet already ready for the meeting. So we have the meeting with heads of department and teachers. They can input codes onto Sims or the spreadsheet from John Moore. One means there's been an issue, classroom teachers onto it, they know what they're doing to resolve the issue regarding whatever part of the curriculum needs to be taught. Two is there's a concern, like there's a problem and some specific intervention beyond the classroom may be needed. And this allows us, of course, to see how many twos there are for particular classes, how many twos there are for particular pupils, and it allows the head of department to have a rich conversation with their line manager and SLT, ensuring that SLT, the senior leaders, are able to speak about pupil progress in the curriculum specific to subjects every week in particular year groups. And it means, as I said earlier, that SLT get an overview every 5 weeks of every pupil's progress in every subject. Like, of course, like what the actual outcome of that might be could be anything from, using our prep time that we organise in secondary school. It might be small group teaching, it might be some breakfast or after school club intervention. It could be a conversation with a subject lead to work out what's going on in terms of the curriculum or the barriers, where the expertise is. It could be parents, pastoral leaders. It could be a very large number of things, but nonetheless, it's useful to have that information because and we say explicitly, like if you put a 2 down for every pupil in your class, then at least I know that you know your class, because you're not going to put that unless it's true. And so it's low stakes. Nobody gets sanctioned for saying there's a problem here in my class, they're not learning the curriculum. That's for us then to solve as a team and as a school.
And then this is just sort of how the whole school calendar works, as we mentioned. So you can see the cycle that, you know, in 1 year, the middle leaders will be meeting with their team to discuss a year group. And then the following week, it gets picked up on at the senior leadership line management conversation. So you've got that kind of working through each time.
And we start to share this at Parents' Evening as well. I mean, one of the things is we get very close to 100% attendance to Parents' Evenings through our culture, but senior leaders will meet with, as well as all the subject teachers, senior leaders will meet with the pupils who have the most kind of cause for concerns, triangulated with summative assessments and so on, in order to make sure that parents are on board with the actions that we're taking as a school to make sure pupils learn the curriculum and make progress.
Great. So, like, we've got 2 minutes approximately to go. I can see that you've answered some questions already in the chat. So I'm just thinking, really, what would be, we've got time for one, Stuart?
I think we've answered them, actually. I've answered them. So yeah. One of the ones was, there was a good question about, like, what if, like, I guess, like, you got a class where they're all 2s, right? Like, everyone's not making progress. We've done some quality first teaching. There's like, and I guess my answer to that is, look, there's a problem. Like, we have to be open and honest. There's a problem. We're not saying the teacher's a problem. We're not saying the curriculum's a problem. We're not saying that the support, we don't know what the problem is, but but now at least we don't have we're not in a situation where without this system, we would be like not realizing there's a problem until the exam or the GCSE or whatever it might be. Everyone's missed out this massive chunk of the curriculum because it just wasn't explained very well or whatever it might be. What you do about that, of course, is really, like, I mean, we just went through it. It could be a number of things. It could be none of the things that are on there, but we have to be open and honest that there's a problem. And then there's a second question. What does it look like in primary school? Like, we're working that out, and I know you want to talk about this a bit more so, but we're working that out because we think that this is applicable to primary school, but we've got to be really careful not to replicate kind of the proxies, like what DDI looks like, but actually the substance of focusing on the curriculum, progression through the curriculum, formative assessment, and making sure we almost capture the formative assessment in a manner that makes sure that we know that all pupils are making progress, or we're doing something about those that aren't in each area of the curriculum. I don't know if you've got more to add to that bit on primary, Sally.
I think as well, like, I really hope that when you get the link to the videos, it helps, because the primary video is the longest one that will link, and basically you will see in it where you've got the teachers talking about where they've used the information they've got from DDI, so where they've got their messy mark books and they've looked at what that's telling them, and then they've gone through with their phase lead, and they've then actually looked at what the TAFs are, what the national curriculum is, what the curriculum map says the pupils need to have mastered, and they've really married that up. And they go into quite a lot of detail about what then that's enabled, how that's informed their planning, and then they give specific examples of how they've then planned the next lesson based on what they know. And it was all part of them. They, you know, it wasn't recorded for this, it was recorded as part of their maths CPD, where they were sort of spotlighting some particular good examples of where teachers had used their responsive teaching to inform the next step. So I really think that will help to see a sense of how it works at primary, because that video, when I watched, I was like, this is brilliant, like the depth of thought. And one of the questions that the head says is, she sort of says, that sounds like it might have taken quite a long time though, and the teacher's like, it actually didn't, like, it sounds like a lot, but when you know the pupils and then you know the information and you've got it all out in front of you, the picture kind of emerges quite quickly as this is the problem, and then you've got the support of the more experienced phase lead helping you work out, okay, where do we go next with this? So I'm hoping that will really help.
And I know we've got to go, but final question was read write maths or foundation subjects as well, and we do it in not all subjects, but not just read write maths is right, isn't it? And I should say that the stuff that Sally has put together to send out to you in order to use in your schools is comprehensive and brilliant. And I can say that because I wasn't involved in doing it, but it's really worth having a look through, because it's very, very good, and it gets to the substance of why we think this works, and we have some evidence it works as well.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart. So I think we'll wrap up now. So as I said, you'll get loads of follow-up materials. If you are interested, so next year in September we're formally launching, so these are like tester sessions for the knowledge exchange. So there will be, the membership of the network is free. By joining the network, you're just basically giving us permission to let you know when we've got things like this happening, so that you can book in, and you'll get priority booking as well, so before we make it public on Twitter and things like that. So yeah, so much of it will be free. There are some aspects of our professional development which we are opening up that that people can then buy into, and again, members of the network will get a much reduced price on the additional CPD that we can offer as well. It's basically a knowledge sharing platform, best practice sharing platform that has different layers of you getting involved in it. So you can just be a part of it and know what's happening and come to the free sessions, or you might choose that you actually want to buy into a whole package of CPD. So it's entirely up to you. Some people have said as an individual, I don't know if I'm allowed to join. You absolutely are. So, you know, although it does say school on the form, you don't need to put your school down if you're just joining the network as an individual. So have a look at our website. I should have posted it in the chat, so hopefully it's still there even if you joined after I put it in. But if not, as if by magic, when you close Zoom anyway, your browser will have taken you to our Advantage Schools Knowledge Exchange page, and there's a form on there which you just can put your details in if you want us to keep you up to date with information. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me and ask. And thank you very much for joining us this evening at the end of what has been another really difficult term. So we do appreciate it and really hope it was helpful. And yeah, have the best summer. Thank you very much. Bye.